It serves as a platform for fostering dialogue and promoting intellectual growth. I extend my heartfelt gratitude to the authors whose generosity with their knowledge and passion made this anthology a reality. I'm sure Dr. Boma will be talking about some of them. To the editorial board, Ambassador Cabral Blay Amihe, Ivor Ajimandria, Ambassador Kuya Dansua, I noticed there earlier on, Ambassador Kwame Tinkra, I noticed him earlier on, Ambassador Edith Hazel and Koku Doche, who nurtured this project with great care, and to each one of you, our distinguished guests, for gracing this occasion with your presence. I particularly like to thank Professor Mensah Bonsu, Ambassador Agriolins, and the Chancellor of the University of Ghana, Mrs. Chinyese, for accepting to be part of this launch at very short notice. I need to apologize to all of you again. In fact, later during today, Mrs. Chinyese will be launching the CFR Memoir Fund. The idea of the fund is to assist retired ambassadors, diplomats, international civil servants, people like Bombande, to write their memoirs so that students can learn from it, like Professor Gia. So this fund will be today launched by the Chancellor of the University of Ghana, Mrs. Chinyese. As we embark on this intellectual journey, embracing the wisdom within these pages and harnessing the power of knowledge to navigate the complex tapestry of foreign policy, diplomacy, and international relations, let us strive for a world that fosters understanding, collaboration, and peace. Thank you once again for your presence at this book launch, and let me take the opportunity to welcome all those who have just joined us by Zoom, particularly the Commissioner for Political Affairs of the AU Commission, Ambassador Dankule. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador D.K. Osei, President of the Council. I'd like to recognize His Excellency Colonel Awoki Panasa, Ambassador of Togo to Ghana. Apologies for omitting you earlier. I'd also like to recognize Mr. Kwon Isuman, who is a counsel to the President of Ghana. So I'd like to introduce now the chair for the evening. As I said earlier, she's really up on the high table, is very well known, but just a couple of highlights. She's been a career diplomat for many years, retired now, of course, but she served all over the world, in London, in Brussels, in Addis, in Geneva, in Austria, and of course she excelled. She earned the order of one of the highest awards, and even beyond that, she also received an award from John Paul II, who has since become a saint. Not many people dead or alive have received awards from saints. She these days spends time supporting causes such as CFR and also UNDP and the Legal Center for International Affairs and Intellectual Property, World Intellectual Property Organization. But she spends most of her time tending beautiful flowers in her home. She, above all, she went to Wesley Hills High School, which is the best school in Ghana after Achimota School. Ladies and gentlemen,
entitled Contemporary Issues in Foreign Policy, Diplomacy, and International Affairs, which is a compilation of speeches delivered between 2019 and 2022 under the Distinguished Lecture Series program of the Council, as well as the launch of the Memoirs Project Fund of the Council. I also joined the President of the Council in extending a warm welcome to you all, and thank you for accepting the Council's invitation to grace these events with your distinguished presence. In her contribution to the publication, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Regional Integration, the Honorable Shirley Ayokoboche, emphasized, and I quote, the need to consolidate the guiding principles and objectives of Ghana's foreign policy and diplomatic practices into a handbook that would serve as ready reference to various stakeholders. Of such a handbook. The speeches are delivered by persons of standing, drawn from a wide spectrum of professions and backgrounds, from political figures to international civil servants, to writers, to diplomats, constitute a truly international group. The publication captures their thinking on a wide range of issues of moment in international relations, issues such as multilateralism, higher education, the fabric of society, governance, and democracy. And this is by no means an exhaustive list. The publication is carefully and uniquely crafted in terms of the depth of substance as well as the flavor of the ensuing discussion. It is no ordinary handbook. It combines scholarship and reality, often providing perspectives which are thought-provoking and deepen our appreciation of the issues involved, not only at the level of international relations, but also at the national level. Such reflection is indeed indispensable for sound decision-making and policy formulation and implementation. It brings us full circle to the statement of the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Regional Integration regarding the need for a ready reference. Contemporary issues in foreign policy, diplomacy, and international affairs is such a ready reference. Ladies and gentlemen, a distinguished assemblage such as this more than appreciates that publishing is not without financial cost. That is why I am confident that you will support the Memoirs Project Fund of the Council on Foreign Relations Ghana, which will also be launched this afternoon at this event. Indeed, the fund will underpin the implementation of one of the objectives of the Council, namely the publication of the memoirs of retired diplomats and other professionals, books and articles on international issues. We are completely spoilt for choice. We have 2 launches. I thank you for the courtesy of your attention, and we look forward together, I'm sure, to the review of the ready reference, Contemporary Issues in Foreign Policy, Diplomacy, and International Relations, as well as the launch of the Memoirs Project Fund of the Council. I now invite Dr. Frederick Boama to conduct the book review. You have the floor, sir. Thank you.
Good evening, Your Excellencies. Madam Chair, Ambassador Mrs. Agnes Aggrey-Orleans, good evening, Your Excellencies. Madam Chair, Ambassador Mrs. Agnes Aggrey-Orleans, our guest speaker, Her Ladyship Professor Justice Henrietta Mensah Bonsu, our special guest, Dr. Mrs. Mary Chinwe Hesse. Please permit me to stand on the protocols already established at this event and welcome you all. My role as the reviewer of the book we are about to launch this evening is a very simple one, and I'm going to be as brief as possible. However, if I overstay my welcome, please draw my attention. The book is entitled Contemporary Issues in Foreign Policy, Diplomacy and International Affairs. As the name suggests, it consists of a compilation of scholarship and experiences from a diverse pool of distinguished speakers who have delivered insightful and thought-provoking lectures under the banner of the CFR Distinguished Guest Lecture Series. The publisher of the book, the Council on Foreign Relations Ghana, has carefully selected 18 chapters covering 357 pages of these lectures for compilation. It is dated June 2023. The book also comes with 3 appendices and an index for ease of reference. The book is bound in hardcover. The design and artwork that adorns the book is of the highest quality, reminiscent of the quality of its contents. Having said this, I'm sure you are curious to hear about the contents of the book itself. But give me a moment to say a few words about CFR Ghana and the relevance of this book. CFR Ghana has a long history, but its current lease of life was bettered in 2019 to backstop and support the government of Ghana in its pursuit of foreign policy and international relations in general in Ghana. As a testament of its role and importance, CFR was launched by the President of the Republic of Ghana with dignitaries such as the current and former foreign affairs ministers, parliamentarians, excellencies like yourselves, members of the diplomatic corps, academicians, traditional leaders, and business leaders, among others. The overarching message from the launch of CFR was excellence and solidarity. And I'm happy to note that a number of you who were at the launch are here today also to support the launch of this all-important book. I'm sure most of you would agree with me that Africa needs to tell its own story, and the existing narrative controlled by Western scholarship and institutions is not in favor of us. Quite clearly, CFR Ghana was launched with a very clear understanding of this mandate and how to achieve same. It was also clear that there was a yearning gap needed in the knowledge production and dissemination in the field of foreign policy Diplomacy and International Affairs. One of the clearest absences from the field of international relations in Ghana and most of Africa is that of think tanks and African-authored books and resources. This book, therefore, is one of the many attempts to fill this gap, and as noted by one of the authors at page 142 of the book, and I quote, learning across time requires literacy, the ability to record what you have done in a way that future generations can read and build on. It is a sort of an integral part of advanced human learning. So it is quite important that CFR Ghana has taken this initiative to put in hard print the resources that have been gathered over the period of 2019 to 2022. Now let me turn my attention to the book itself. Now, I would want to comment on the approach of the book. And as noted by the chairperson of the launch, the book is very practical in its lectures and the presentations. And this is, I would also call it international relations in practice. And having read the book, if I had my way, I would add practice to the title of the book because it really presents from a very practical experience and perspective the knowledge and experiences of the authors of the book. Let me also say from the onset that the review of this book does not follow the orthodox approach because the book itself is unique in its presentation. It adopts what you may call the Socratic approach at the end of each author's presentation. This gives the audience an opportunity to probe further on the topic that has been presented, as well as related issues that the author is then invited to comment on and give further insights. Towards this end, I have not just reviewed the author's presentations, but I have also reviewed your contributions that you have made over time towards the presentations that were offered by the various authors. Now to the main work. The book deals with a wide range of issues, and as I have already indicated, it covers 357 pages with 18 chapters. That means it's a very voluminous book. Now, for ease of the work that I was asked to do, I categorized the presentations into 5 themes. And it is based on these 5 themes that I've done the review. First, I looked at the African state and security. I also looked at education. I looked at the economy. I looked at multilateralism and COVID-19 pandemic. And I also looked at Africa and Europe relations. So I'll take the first theme, the African state and security. Under this, I look at the arguments on colonial boundaries, ethnicity, coup d'etats, and the governance challenges that faces Africa. Let me set the tone by looking at the chapter of the book on Afro-pessimism against horizons of Ebri optimism, in which the author situates the historical connections and rivalry between Ghana and Nigeria. The chapter delicately places the need to examine the concept of humanity in the pursuit of foreign policy between Ghana and Nigeria, and examines issues such as the expulsion of Nigerians from Ghana in 1969, and subsequently the seeming retaliation by the Nigerian government in what became known as the Ghana Must Go in 1983, Nigeria's closure of its land borders in 2019, and the closure of Nigerian shops in Ghana under the GIPC Act requiring the payment of some up to $1 million in the retail sector. This, the author argues that, and I quote, "I have always held that states and nations can act stupidly, but humanity must rise above the stupidities of government. I have a very simple credo, that humanity transcends state or nation, if our nation's humanity was, and I believe that other nations and states' humanity must continue to be. The author further probes further and looks at the interconnectedness of the political history of Ghana and Nigeria and how events of the past continue to present security challenges today. The author looks at the lack of agreement in the famous Ebui meeting of 1967, or should I say Ebui, in the words of the author himself. In the author's analysis, this failure continues to haunt Nigeria in terms of the Biafran and other separatist groups who clamor for independence and autonomy. As noted by the author, the question of colonial borders and the discord within Africa is not peculiar to Nigeria. And I believe those of us in Ghana who are familiar with the Homeland Study Group and like agitations would agree. Similar situations exist in Cameroon, Ethiopia, amongst others. The question of uti possidetis juris, the right of self-determination and succession, continues unabated, and as would be seen in other presentations, is at the heart of the governance challenges and instability in Africa. Muffled in citizens' dissatisfaction, it continues to manifest as a security discord, religiosity, what the author calls religious imperialism, and how it impacts on the psyche of the African, and governance challenges, dictatorships, bloodied elections, suspension of opposition, among others. I challenge you to digest this further when you get your copy of the book. Is there an Afro-pessimism, or perhaps optimism from the new Ebui, or perhaps Ebui? Further to this, the book presents more focused authorships on crisis within Africa. The first of which I would look at is the Chad crisis after Idris Deby, and deals with security concerns that affect the entire Sahelian region in most parts of Africa. This is understood from the argument that Chad borders 6 countries and 4 sub-regions of the continent. In this regard, its large military base, which stands between 45,000 to 50,000 relative to its population of about 16 million, becomes a worrying statistic. Comparatively, Ghana, with a population of about 30 million, for instance, maintained an army of about 16,000, whilst Nigeria, with a population of about 150 million plus, maintains an army of about 120,000. And quite clearly, this presents the picture that the Chadian people are dealing with and its impact on the sub-region. It is argued by the author that with this strength, Chad has played a key role in the stability and instability of the region. It has been involved in Central African Republic, Mali, Nigeria, and has been a major contributor to MINUSMA, amongst others. It is argued that a destabilized Chad affects the phenomena of transhumans and the Fulani herdsmen who migrates downwards through Nigeria, Benin, Togo, Ghana, and so on, further spreading insecurity in the region. The relevance of the author's argument relative to Chad is that it represents a macrocosm of the region in terms of governance, ethnicity, security, employment, all fueled by external interests and colonial legacies. The chapters on security and the African state also looks at the Malian crisis and how it has affected the security situation in the Sahel and threatens West Africa. In this regard, the author notes at page 162 of the book as follows. On September 2011, and I quote, on September 2011, there was a very simple 4-page document from the Early Warning Directorate of ECOWAS. That document sought to talk about what is happening in Libya and the potential disintegration of not only Mali, but Niger and the wider implication for West Africa. It looked at 2 levels. That on one hand, you had a group of Tuareg rebels who were a fighting machinery in support of the Gaddafi regime. And that as the Libyan crisis was peaking in 2011 and going into 2012, this fighting machinery with weapons, with their all-terrain Toyota Hilux vehicles, with their sophisticated weapons, with cash, were coming back to the Sahelian region, and to that extent with a potential for destabilization, end of quote. Indeed, the author argues that the former US President, Mr. Obama, has expressed regret in the handling of the Libyan crisis because quite clearly it has led to what? A destabilized region where the spread of jihadist movements and instability continues to spread. Its impact on the state of Mali, it is argued, has been devastating with 5 prime ministers in 5 years. Given the size of Mali, about 1,300,000 square kilometers and a population of about 90 million, its impact on the neighboring 7 countries it borders cannot be overemphasized. Mali has become the theater of counterinsurgency with about 36 contingents from different countries. The question that is left hanging is, where is ECOWAS and the AU? Perhaps you'll find the answers when you get your copy of the book. Similar conditions exist as demonstrated by the presentations on Guinea. French colonial policies in terms of the freezing of the exploitation of resources as a buffer meant that Guinea, as compared to other colonized territories, became undeveloped by the time of decolonization. Similarly, post-independence, the author argues that the French continued to undermine and interfere in the political leadership, leading to its early adoption of Marxist or socialist policies. This resulted in the pursuit of policies that undermined individual wealth creation, poverty, repression, and mass exodus from Guinea. Ultimately, this resulted in weak institutions, governance challenges, lack of private sector investments, poverty, among others. This also presents a semblance of some democratic backsliding in the West African sub-region. The security situation in Ethiopia and Sudan and a number of African states are no different from the above pictures, and the narratives involves secession, ethnic dominance, and the masses, the victims, the ordinary persons, become the victims of such situations. I'll now move on to the second theme, which is on education. The author at page 139 invites the audience to undertake a simple mental exercise of picturing 2 societies with different trust thresholds. And I would quote and hope that you may undertake that exercise even as we launch this book. So in the words of the author, and so let me begin by inviting you to embark on a thought exercise with me, centered around 2 societies. Imagine a society where everybody is dishonest, everybody steals, everybody lies, and nobody can be trusted. So that's and when I say everybody, I mean everybody. Children, parents, people, adults, working governments, etc. That's the first set of scenario. Then you can also imagine another society where nobody lies, nobody steals, nobody commits crimes, everybody is honest. So these are 2 societies. I want us just to do a thought exercise on them. Imagine what it would be like to live in any of these societies. And as I even talk about it, I can imagine what is running through your head in terms of how these 2 societies would present or look like given the sort of security challenges that we are dealing with in Africa. But the author makes a forceful argument for quality and ethical education in Africa. And all of us gathered here, I believe, subscribe to the notion that education is the engine that propels societies. Be it formal, informal, traditional, or otherwise, education is important for knowledge production, dissemination, and application, and the growth of our societies. The author argues that learning across times requires literacy, the ability to record what you've done in a way that future generations can read and build on. It's sort of an integral part of an advanced human learning, and all this stuff education does from the primary through to higher education. Other authors of the book support this argument and place education as a key to unlocking the potential of the continent, specifically to resolve the looming youth crisis, reduce our dependence on the environment in the face of a climate crisis, stem the tide in the expanding jihadist movements, and improve living standards amongst the peoples of this continent. Quite clearly, it also ties into the question of security and the stability identified as the fault lines by previous authors of the book. The third theme that I will talk about is on the economy. It is tried that the relationship between development, peace, and security is well established. One of the key presentations I would encourage you to interrogate further when you procure your copies of the book is a presentation on chapter 7 of the book entitled Knowing the Beginning Well, Governance, Democracy, and Development in Africa. The author identifies a number of reasons for economic failure in most parts of Africa, and central to his argument, even though multidimensional, I will dwell on just two of them. The question of lack of policy continuity, and second, lack of attention to institutional design and policy implementation, what you call political will or leadership. By using illustrations from 5 countries of the continent, Sudan, Zambia, Kenya, Uganda, and Ethiopia, and his experiences from the ECA, the author builds his argument to support the position that, and I quote, by using examples from these countries to illustrate why policy matters, why institutional effectiveness and capacity matter, why country ownership is a critical, and why strong visionary leadership from the people who will lead us is necessary, that is the story that I want to share with you in terms of my country experiences. The author acknowledges that the relevance of the AfTA in promoting trade in Africa, but at page 109 of the book expresses worry about the way the AfTA is being implemented. So my worry is that, and I quote, so my worry is that there is a lot of principle, the principle of free trade, regional public institutions, all ideas under the AfTA, but implementation of it depends on having a strong, robust secretariat that can drive it, people together, track progress, and bring together political leaders when things are not moving. So we need to support the secretariat and need to work with them, end of quote. So quite clearly, even though the potential of the AfTA is highlighted by the author is also quite worried about the way the AfTA is currently being implemented. And I believe quite a number of you are quite familiar with the story of the AfTA and where we currently are in terms of the implementation progress. The fourth theme that the book deals with is multilateralism and the COVID-19 pandemic. At the very onset, the book examines what we consider to be our new normal, the COVID-19 pandemic. In this regard, the book looks at the impact of the pandemic and how all aspects of life, including interstate relations, has been affected. Even though the author makes several important submissions, I shall just talk about one of them, whether or not the pandemic would bring an end to multilateralism in the pursuit of protectionist ideals by states. The author argues forcefully that despite initial skepticism about multilateralism, protectionist ideals would not prevail. In this regard, examples denoting cooperation between states were cited by the author. Using the smallpox example, the author posits that the US and China would collaborate to lead global solutions to the pandemic, as was done by the US and the former USSR to deal with the smallpox problem. Other chapters of the book looks at the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and the author argues that its impact on Africa can be both negative and positive. It was up to African states to look for opportunities in terms of collaborations towards agriculture and production and the trade sector. The book also presents a chapter on Africa-EU alliance. And as we know, the relationship between Africa and the European Union has undergone several dimensions, from colonization, slavery, decolonization, and the abolition of the slave trade, towards donor support, EPA, interim EPA, and the likes. This chapter is insightful as it tackles the myriad of opportunities for job creation, financing, and empowering the youth and businesses in Africa. It also tackles investments, particularly in renewable energy supplies and sustainability. According to the author, the aim is to create a partnership of equals and move beyond aid. To achieve this, education and the opportunities provided, or the opportunities such as the Erasmus Scholarship Program and the need for a continental FTA, has been highlighted. Indeed, those of you who are moved to get copies of this book, both from the private and public sector and other decision makers, will learn a lot from this, because the author really goes into a lot of depth in terms of the opportunities for collaboration between Africa and the EU. Students would also benefit immensely from this. Now, as part of my criticism, as part of my review, I'm required to criticize the book. But I do not criticize the book. I only offer two suggestions for improvement. The first that I would offer is that while the Socratic approach adopted by the book is enriching, it appears a number of important questions went unanswered, given the number of questions that were usually posed to the presenter before he was called upon to answer. So a number of questions were lost in that. The second suggestion that I would add is that most of the presentations were analysis and discourse around evolving issues. It would have been useful to date stamp these presentations so that the readers can contextualize them in that regard. My conclusion: even though none of the authors of the book laid any claim to possessing prophetic prowess, the book, in its analysis and predictions of the outcome of a number of events in the areas above, particularly on the security situation in our dear continent, have been foretelling. For me, there is only one explanation for this: the depth and quality that the authorship of this book brings, and I urge you to procure a copy. I hope CFR Ghana has enough copies of this book this evening to satisfy your demands, be you a student, academics, policymakers, media practitioners, security analysts, diplomats, politicians, business people, traditional leaders, CSOs, and a wide spectrum of stakeholders in the area of foreign policy and diplomacy. Thank you for your attention, and please get your copies.
Thank you, Dr. Mama, for that comprehensive review. As you spoke, I was looking at the expressions on people's faces, the faces of members of the audience, and I have no doubt in my mind, judging from those expressions, that everyone is dying to obtain a copy of the publication. I also note in passing that some of you hear best with your eyes closed. I will now invite Mr. Kweku Sajiado to introduce our guest speaker. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'd like to recognize Mr. Emmanuel Akwete, Executive Director of of IDEC, Institute for Development, something, IDEC anyway. And also Mr. Opata, I believe, is also here from the wing of the foreign ministry that's closer to Richard. So now I proceed to with a brief introduction of the guest speaker. As you can imagine, just like the rest of the other speakers on the high table, if we were to do a compilation, of their CVs, it probably will be bigger than the book we're launching today. And so I'm keeping it short. Professor Mensah Bonsu is currently a Justice of the Supreme Court of Ghana. Before her appointment to the bench, she was a Professor of Law at the University of Ghana, School of Law, and also served as Director of the Legon Center for International Affairs and Diplomacy. She's a past president of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences. She's had a distinguished career spanning 3 decades in Ghana, in Liberia, and elsewhere. And she's threatening me, she's kicking me in the leg right now to end it here. And so, well, I must add that Professor Mensah Bonsu was educated at the best school in Ghana, Wesley Girls High School, second to Achimota School. Ladies and gentlemen, another one of them.
Thank you, Kweku. Thank you, Kweku. Good evening, Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Let me also stand on the protocols. The paper is a little long. I asked Ambassador Say how many minutes had been allocated to me. He said, take all the time you want. So I hope you brought your bedding and some sleeping material. I'm sure he will provide the dinner, but they'll need somewhere to sleep. So I have, since joining the bench, also been obliged to take a vow of silence. So on this occasion, I came here not dressed as a judge, so that I could speak on the topic that I had been asked to. In our culture, when you have to say something bluntly or something unpleasant, we add the expression sebi. So I am supplying you Excellencies with a basket full of sebis. If I say anything that I shouldn't have said in the way I've said it, kindly take one. And Madam Chair, I wish to begin by thanking the CFR once again for making me a part of the effort to chronicle the impact and influence of a think tank of this nature. Too often, whether by the influence of an oral culture or lack of resources or indolence, we in this part of the world do not chronicle our works in written forms, and so with the passage of time, their impact and significance are forgotten. I believe that international affairs is liquid history, and a failure to chronicle it while it is in the making ends up with interpretations and accounts we cannot accept or agree with, but which cannot be effectively contradicted by reinterpretation. Therefore, let me use this opportunity to chronicle my personal appreciation for your efforts, Mr. President, and your team, for trapping the liquid history by enlisting the enduring quality of the written word in order not to merely control the solid form as it cools with the passage of time, but to have our voice firmly captured in the narrative. To repeat an old proverb, until lions have their own historians, tales of hunting would always glorify the hunter. We have for too long left our story to be told by others, left our point of view and even our feelings to be communicated by others, and then merely sat back and whimpered complaints after the fact of bias and suppression of relevant facts. CFR's model of doing business is different, and I can only applaud the effort and share in the glory of being associated with such a worthy enterprise. Hearty congratulations to the CFR. Your place and reputation as the pioneer private think tank on international affairs and international relations is intact. So I share some thoughts. At the beginning of the 1990s, when it was certain the Soviet Union had reached its sell-by date and was crumbling, scholars and practitioners alike began to look forward to an era of peace. This was because the fierce competitive superpower politics that produced proxy wars in many areas of the world appeared to have ended with the end of the Cold War and the ushering in of a unipolar world. However, unforeseen events have since changed the dynamics and introduced so many uncertainties and imponderables that few can claim to be able to predict the end game of the current situation with any confidence. As if out of the blue, the sleeping giant China has re-emerged on the international scene. The resurgence of Russia is visible. A new power bloc, the BRICS, is becoming more and more assertive, and other blocs and other forms are regrouping. The non-aligned movement seems to have gone into hibernation, and Africa continues to speak in muted and disunited tones. The demon of proxy wars is alive and well, Sudan on my mind, as is the tension that is produced by intrastate conflict, fueled by inordinate ambition of leaders in various countries to remain in power by fair or foul means. In contrast, multilateralism, though being hammered left, right, and center, continues to be a force for good, even if its grip on situations seems too mild for the comfort of those who believe in firm and strong action. As the recent ill-fated and poorly executed peace mission by some 6 or 7 leaders of Africa to Ukraine and Russia proved, multilateralism continues to be the means by which the constantly disrespected Africa can attain some clout and even momentum in world affairs. You may take one, Sebi, for. Kofi Annan, our illustrious compatriot, is quoted as saying that he was a stubborn optimist. This is re-echoed by Her Excellency Maria Fernanda Espinosa Garces, then the President of the UN General Assembly, in her lecture, Responding to Global Challenges in a Fast-Changing World. She paints a gloomy but realistic picture thus, quote, "These trends and challenges have produced a crisis of confidence in governments and institutions. Justified concerns about unchecked globalizations have mutated into a backlash against the very principles that give power to the people, such as human rights, gender equality, and social justice. We are seeing a rise in nationalist sentiment extremism, in unilateral approaches, in attacks on international laws and norms. This is creating a difficult environment for the decisions we need to take in the coming months and years. Just when we need multilateralism more than ever, global cooperation is being questioned and even undermined in some quarters, unquote. After this melancholy-inducing portrait of the state of multilateralism, she ends on a note that she too is a stubborn optimist. I can only whisper with slumped shoulders that I'm a resigned optimist. Resigned because there's no real choice otherwise for us in the global south. In this uncertain mix of affairs comes an even more unpredictable phenomenon, the COVID-19 pandemic. This has left us many lessons, some of which are already receding from our consciousness as we return to our old ways of organizing our lives. Despite this reality, COVID the Leveler has taught us that not only is humanity linked in ways that we had overlooked, but that no one has superior answers to life's questions. Captured in common Ghanaian street lingo in the Akan language, Obia and Obia. To it, no one has all the answers or holds all the aces. The shock of discovering how little our lives on the continent mattered and how politics could interfere in forging a common front to fight off this new enemy has left us scars and lessons. The value of self-reliance has become more real to us since we waited cap in hand to ask for help with procuring life-saving vaccines, and that we must face the challenge of doing more for ourselves in every sphere of our lives. I also learned that strategic interests could emanate from any quarter, and so had to be kept in mind even as half the world was dying. That in any situation, however tragic, could produce unintended benefits or provide new opportunities for self-advancement. If only we could anticipate them by intelligent guesses and prepare for such an eventuality. A never to be forgotten lesson imparted by developments in respect of even the name of the new disease was that one had to be on the lookout for nomenclature that could import blame and stigmatization for a condition or feed stereotypes which could have real-life consequences on lives. For instance, tweets by President Trump between March 2020 and March 2021, referring to the disease as, quote, the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus, on account of it being first detected in Wuhan, China, caused China to raise such a storm of protest that WHO responded with the official name COVID-19. Not long thereafter, a virulent variant was discovered in India, leading to it being referred to as the Indian variant. On 22nd May 2021, the Indian Ministry of Technology formally wrote to social media outlets to delete any references to Indian variant, and that as that had a tendency to create prejudice against Indians as well as being bad for their image. Everyone complied, and soon WHO came out with the name Delta variant and Delta Plus. I have since wondered why Africa was alleged that HIV/AIDS emanated from the African green monkey or some such African-based source. Although the disease had first presented in Europe and the United States, African governments and researchers did not challenge this, and soon travel advisories were issued in Africa. And people who had visited Africa were required to answer a questionnaire as to whether they had engaged in sexual intimacy while in Africa. Africa has remained tagged by its silence and has remained to this day the home continent of HIV/AIDS. Then came an outbreak of a virulent disease named after a location in Uganda, Ebola disease. The very serious outbreak in 3 closely related countries in West Africa, Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, claimed over 11,000 lives because it was largely unknown in West Africa before then. The outbreak was promptly traced to a little boy in Guinea, and the close personal interactions among the closely related people in the 3 countries took the blame for the spread of the disease. No one gave a convincing explanation of how a 3-year-old became the source of the spread, except that the story we are told was that he must have picked up the virus from bats because he used to play on a tree stump visited by bats. Although this stretched credibility somewhat thin, we held our peace and did not counter the narrative or protest at the name. On a personal level, I realized the seriousness of the stigmatization of West Africans when I was nearly put in quarantine while transiting through an airport in Hong Kong en route to Japan because I was from West Africa. I did not think to protest when I returned home, nor see fit to report the incident to anyone, and merely laughed it off. The experience of COVID has taught me that far from being excited that a word in one's language has made it to the international plane, we should have protested about kwashiorkor from Ghana and Lassa fever from Nigeria, so that the diseases would be given proper scientific names and not be used to stigmatize persons from those locations. Thanks to the work of Ambassador William Awinado Kanyerige and Ken Thompson in their very enlightening paper in Chapter 2, COVID-19 and its impact on global affairs, CFR has immortalized the COVID era for Ghanaians and other persons who might have access to this book. Stories from the dim past that once upon a time, a disease tagged as a pandemic called COVID-19 attacked the world and had immeasurable impact on us, on the lives we lived before, might otherwise have sounded mythical. Reading the piece, I certainly could relate to many of the points canvassed and thoroughly discussed by the 2 authors. In February 2021, I delivered a lecture at an international conference organized by the Patrice Lumumba People's Friendship University of Moscow, named Africa and the Formation of the New System of International Relations 2021. The conference was under the general theme, Development Cooperation with Africa in the Post-COVID-19. The title of the paper I was requested to present via Zoom was Managing Conflict and Political Processes Despite COVID. I was intrigued that a Russian university had known where to find me and approached me for a paper on the impact of COVID on conflict processes and political processes. On the day of the conference, the variety of papers presented on various panels from many universities in Africa were on topics that were not even COVID-related, making me wonder whether the conference organizers had failed to guide authors by insisting on greater fidelity to the theme. In the course of further idle reflection, I decided that Russia was probably readying itself to play a bigger role on the international scene, and that the conference was about soft power interests in Africa post-COVID. Consequently, I repackaged my thoughts on this subject for the benefit of the students at LESIAD at their Wednesday seminar. For it told me that those who were thinking ahead realized that the onset of this disease was a watershed in history. In those lectures, my concentration was on the terrain of conflict and UN's peace operations. In thoughts reminiscent of some of the issues discussed by the 2 authors in the chapter, I noted that the disease had not merely exposed issues of race, age, and class cleavages within and among countries and regions, but also constraints that it placed on démarches for conflict prevention and peacemaking efforts. The Russian conference served as a forceful reminder that the world never sleeps, and that every event presents opportunities in geopolitics for self-assertion and even hegemonic soft power outreaches. When the war with Ukraine broke out and African countries were being pressured to take sides, my reflection on the purpose of that conference became even more sober. I wondered again and again if COVID and its impact on Africa had been the real reason, or the convenient excuse to plumb the thoughts of African scholars on pertinent matters and ascertain the point of our needs post-COVID. Like every aspect of our lives, the terrain of peace and conflict prevention was badly affected too. When COVID broke and everyone had to resort to Zoom and such other applications to be able to carry on the business of their particular enterprise, so did those involved in ongoing negotiations in conflicts around the world. However, in general terms, some aspects of our lives are easier to conduct from a distance than others. For instance, the good offices of the Secretary General yields the most with in-person interactions and not merely by telephone calls. On 23rd March 2020, the Secretary General called for a global ceasefire to facilitate aid delivery and open space for diplomatic engagement and other peace processes. Although some 110 countries, 24 armed groups, many regional organizations, civil society groups, Pope Francis, and other religious leaders endorsed the call, this initiative and accompanying words of support did not translate into concrete action. The attempts to leverage goodwill towards humanity in the days when the whole of humanity was under attack by a new virus did not appear to have yielded any dividend. Airstrikes went on as if there had been no ceasefires. Again, everyone in the field of conflict prevention and mediation knows what advantage interpersonal interaction and even the personal gravitas of a mediator can achieve in mediation. With COVID, the reality was different, and without in-person contact or with social distancing and half-covered faces at in-person meetings, how could some intangible personal attributes be brought to bear upon disputing parties? How could body language be read or subtle messages be communicated by non-verbal communication in advance to advance a mediation? Clearly, opportunities for effective conflict prevention and mediation were lost. Lockdowns and travel restrictions were imposed, and these had to be observed by staff of multilateral agencies, but non-state actors found it advantageous to be able to operate without restriction, and a number of outrages were perpetrated during that time without effective response. The gap between the words of commitment and concrete deeds to actualize that commitment was more in evidence in those days, thereby giving social distancing a whole new dimension. Thankfully, in-person meetings have become possible again and hopefully should bridge the distancing gap that the pandemic imposed on conflict prevention initiatives. The AU Peace and Security Council, at its 974th meeting held on 22nd January 2021, on the situation in the Great Lakes region, determined that it needed an on-site visit. But the only timeline adopted was, quote and unquote, as soon as possible. Further, at its 979th meeting, held on 16 February 2021 on the situation in the Central African Republic, it was resolved that it was important to show solidarity with the people and government of Central African Republic. Yet the timeline was, quote and unquote, in the near future. It was only late in April 2021 that concrete plans could be made to perform these on-site visits. The time lost may have made a difference to subsequent events. Peacekeeping budgets went out of sync as funds had to be diverted from operations to provide for the safety and health of personnel, not to mention the hostility that was generated towards peacekeepers who were perceived to be the purveyors of this imported disease by host communities. And so they had to extend some of their largesse to the host communities to assuage them. These were very troubling times indeed, which perhaps might have been best forgotten or consigned to the items that labor under cultural prohibitions of the unmentionables in Akan Amodin. However, we bury these memories at our peril. And this chapter eloquently points out some of the lessons that we cannot and ought not to forget. On a lighter note, during my presidential address at the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences on Zoom in November 2020, I reminded the audience that COVID had produced a number of incongruous situations worth preserving. I noted that, to my mind, the most incongruous was where gatesmen at banks and other public locations, armed with temperature guns, were having to take the body temperature of doctors before deciding whether it was safe to let them into the premises. Thanks to this chapter in the CFR publication, these memories and the lessons therefrom will keep alive as time pushes them off our consciousness. Ken Thompson's observations and economic predictions have turned out to be prophetic and have all come to pass. His constant reference to cloud and silver lining to remind us that valuable opportunities have opened up which we must not let go, must receive attention. For instance, in those days, we were obliged to learn to do business by alternative means, and this must stay with us. Certainly, the online ordering and delivery business appears to have responded. There were dire predictions by foreign experts of how many of us poor Africans would die and how bodies might litter the streets of African cities for want of any survivor to bury the dead. This prediction did not come to pass, and as scientists grappled with the possible causes of their failed prophecies, the conclusion, and blithely so, was that data from Africa was unreliable anyway, and that we had many more dead than we were willing to own up to the international community. This explanation did not gel with the observed facts, and it did not explain why satellite images were not showing up many new graves in our cemeteries, even if we were not willing to mourn our dead kith and kin in order to deceive the world. When Her Excellency Amina Mohammed, Deputy Secretary General, was asked about it by Kwaku Sechiado, I take a bow. After her presentation on multilateralism at 75, what next? In chapter 6, her answer was, as a Nigerian, you know we will say it is God's will. But on a serious note, I think that this is not by chance, unquote. She then put it down to how practiced African leaders are in fighting constantly erupting emergencies since the continent had learned from the Ebola crisis, a kind of gym for our leaders to strengthen their muscles. Lo and behold, there was a real scientific explanation, and now propounded by Professor Gordon Awandare of the University of Ghana and his team of virologists. In the course of learning about this disease in order to bring it under control, our universities had the opportunity to secure funds to conduct research to sequence the genes of the variants circulating in the country. Out of this opportunity for research funding has come convincing answers to the question people had to concede they could not explain. These answers, now published, show that there is a definite inverse correlation between the incidence of deaths by serious COVID and areas of endemic malaria. They have also determined that the reason was probably because malaria trained our immune systems and that had aided our bodies to fight off the virus. Africa must begin to claim the necessary credit for the discoveries of its scientists, because we are not just consumers of other people's research. I have come across a historical narrative that the smallpox virus was discovered because a West African slave in Boston told his master that in West Africa they use cowpox, liquid from cowpox, and that protected people from smallpox. And they investigated, and Boston was saved. He remains nameless, and it's such a shame. The chapters that focus on intrastate conflict of the various countries all present serious learning points for all our countries. The roles of non-state actors are highlighted. The unanticipated eruption of intrastate wars in the 1980s and 90s challenged the instruments the international community had designed for dealing with conflict between and among its member states, all of whom were subject to international law. Being members of international community, it meant that there were mechanisms for exacting compliance and points of pressure which could be activated to produce desired outcomes when powerful state actors were found to be out of step with the norms of the community. The failure of the UN to intervene in events that culminated in the genocide in Rwanda caused a major shift in approach to intrastate conflict. The addition of genocide to causes that could constitute, quote and unquote, threats to international peace and security, thereby brought intrastate conflict into the fold of causes that would warrant intervention by the international community. Identifying and deeming such powerful state actors as bearing the greatest responsibility for human rights abuses led to the adoption of new war crimes and crimes against humanity, such as ethnic cleansing, rape as a weapon of war, and recruitment of child soldiers, thus joining the old existing ones of genocide and mass murder. I take a bow, Professor Kwenye here. I'm talking of the ICC. The emergence of leaders who were in opposition to state officials, that is, powerful non-state actors in intrastate conflicts, dictated other shifts in approach, such as their inclusion of sanction regimes like arms embargoes and travel bans, which had been designed for state actors. However, the new protagonists, the non-state actors, were and are of a different caliber. They were not always well educated and may have been thrust into leadership by their propensity and capacity to use violence. Some persons were even sometimes unaware of a legal regime of humanitarian law and of human rights. They did not have foreign bank accounts or other financial interests abroad, nor did they have any reason to travel out of their localities. How effective were these age-old instruments going to be in putting them under pressure to join the negotiation table? The need to examine these instruments and fashion out new tools has thus become preeminent. I speak of the UN peace operations, but I can sense the sapping of energy in the room. And so I'm moving on, but it is provided in writing, so the Secretariat can make it available to those who are interested. I should go on? You are sure they brought their bedding? In 2014, the Secretary General of the UN appointed the high-level independent panel on peace operations, the HIPPO, to examine the terrain of peacekeeping and conflict resolution by the UN and make appropriate recommendations. The HIPPO, on which I was privileged to serve in 2014-2015, coincided with the appointment of two other panels by the General Assembly to review the implementation of Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace and security, and to advise the UN's peace-building agenda. And I believe that Ambassador Chambers referred to it in his paper. These three reviews operated concurrently and so were able to profit from synergies of joined-up consultations. Indeed, the chair and one other member of the 1325 panel were full-fledged members of HIPPO as well, and this made for easy and meaningful linkages. The report presented in June 2015 reaffirmed the basic tenets of the UN peacekeeping of consent, impartiality, and non-use of force except in self-defense and defense of the mission's mandate. The report also recommended that the one-size-fits-all approach to peace operations and peace building should be jettisoned in favor of a situation-specific design. To this end, a peacekeeping mission did not have to be one type of intervention as has traditionally been the case. It need not be a military one only or even a multi-dimensional one, but could be a police one in situations where policing was more an issue than the execution of military tasks. And I know Haiti has benefited from that in times past. The panel was to make recommendations to enhance the performance of the UN. It was from our recommendations that the restructuring of the UN Secretariat was advocated, and the name change of peace operations was proposed to enable the peacekeeping budget to support mediation and other conflict prevention measures and activities. This was because by 2014, the Secretariat was using up to 25% of its budget and extra budgetary resources on political affairs alone. And it was clear that the situation was not only untenable, but unsustainable. To support proposals for reform of the structures, the UN's responses to addressing threats to peace and its conflict resolution could not operate as fragmented and siloed responses belonging to DPKO and DPA as they were known then, but as a continuum. This was the reason the name change of peace operations came into being, and not because, according to Commissioner Adeola, the UN was copying the AU, which had always used peace support operations. The HIPPO report also discouraged the UN from engaging in peace enforcement or other offensive military action because such actions would violate the Capstone Doctrine. It would also make it a party to the war and shrink the space for its political role of mediation and use of good offices in supporting the restoration of peace. The recommendation was that the UN was to draw the line at peace enforcement and pull back from offensive action despite its own involvement in the Force Intervention Brigade in MONUSCO, which had an offensive mandate. We discouraged the UN from going that route. Admittedly, the FIB was very popular with the local people. That was the first time they saw action from UN. But it was also a fact that such a peacekeeping mission's mandate could not sit well with a peace enforcer's mandate within the same space. Apart from shrinking the space for political mediation between the parties, it also made the Blue Helmets a target for attack by warring factions who could not be expected to distinguish between those with offensive mandate and those with peacekeeping mandate. It was also noted that factually, the configuration of UN peacekeeping troops made it unsuitable to engage in offensive action. To this end, where there was a need for offensive action, the UN should work with partners such as regional bodies or coalitions of the willing and leave such action to them. Upon assuming office, the current Secretary General put out a reworked vision in the new initiative called Agenda for Peace, A4P, to work through what it all meant to restructure the Secretariat as recommended and to support a change in the positioning of UN's peace operations. Ironically, This appears not to have improved the perception of the ineffectiveness of peace operations, leading to the recent withdrawal of consent by the government of Mali and the subsequent ordering out of troops from MINUSMA. Partnership with African Union. The framers of the Charter of the UN, in confiding world peace and security to the Security Council, also anticipated that regional bodies would come into their own sometime in the future, and accordingly provided for such eventuality in Chapter 8 of the Charter. In his address on AU response to emerging continental security threats, the Commissioner for Peace and Security, His Excellency Bankole Adeoye, I believe he's online, spoke about the fact that the resolution of AU's problems lies in peace enforcement and not peacekeeping, and so the UN is becoming irrelevant in Africa. I was saddened by this posture because it was on account of that reality that the Secretary General set up the HIPPO in the first place. The resort to Chapter 8 of the UN Charter as the basis for partnership meant that the UN would aid and support and lend support to the AU to enable it to do what it appears to be the best option in certain circumstances in support of the efforts of the UN Security Council. It was clear then that the Somalia model of support through UNSOM and logistics through UNSWA, now UNSOS, was the favored model. What the AU officials at the time were concerned about was the fact that they were not involved in the planning of missions and were never consulted even when missions were rehearted. On its part, the UN Secretariat was concerned the AU Commissioner rightly points out that the problems of 30 years ago are different from the problems of today. That is largely true. In these days, the international community is wrestling with not only the existing challenges, but also newer and more potential, which have been met to complicate matters in an uncomfortable situation. The decade that followed these fundamental shifts in world affairs also coincided with the development and exponential growth of new communication technologies. These have increased access to new ideas of persons wheresoever placed, and to global social networks. The global mobilization of opinion jumped the CNN effect after the development of the 24-hour news network CNN has been occasioned by technology that has enabled the horrors of to be living groups around the world and generated globalized, strident calls for the UN to intervene, even when it is institutionally inappropriate to do so. The new information and communication technologies have not been an unalloyed blessing. Access to the technology of social media has made it possible for the disaffected around the world to link up and join forces and recruit new adherents in far-flung areas of nations in various parts of the world, while democratizing power. The motives of violence for achieving maximum casualty and the use of violence to achieve political ends, otherwise known as terrorism. From heavy weapons indiscriminately used to human bombs deliberately detonated in crowded areas to cause maximum casualty, there has been no lack of technological innovation to make any horrors dreamed up impossible to achieve. On its part, social media has facilitated the ability to mobilize support for ideas or to radicalize young people, thereby expanding such notions of quote and unquote them versus us that underlies every conflict, and facilitating their subsequent recruitment in far-flung areas, and has thus truly globalized the contest for power around the world. We have ourselves witnessed the mobilization of youth for demonstrations in aid of little understood political and social causes. These virtually leaderless demonstrations have presented problems for policing around the world and confounded the age-old theories about crowd control, usually social media has also enabled the spread of information on the production of homemade weapons, disinformation of all kinds to inflame passions, particularly of the youth, conspiracy theories to undermine faith in public institutions and other organs of state. I am informed that the generation that was raised on the power of the written word, that is us, the generation raised on the power of the written word, or as they put it in pidgin English, book no lie, are the most vulnerable. For having been socialized to trust information in writing, we believe everything we read on social media and happily pass it on to friends and relatives. Conspiracy theories of COVID and COVID vaccination have revealed to us the damage that could be caused by the ability to generate information and circulate without any gatekeeping, as used to be the case with news editing, and even social accountability as exacted by the spoken word. As pointed out by the AU Commissioner, the Sahel is a major headache at this time. And I say a lot about the Sahel, which you will find in the book. I skipped to Professor Wole Soyinka has hit the nail right on the head when in his contribution on Afro-pessimism, he points out an obvious truth, that it is impossible to marshal any but military responses to these groups in the Sahel, since their goals are to achieve a redrawing of the map of West Africa and install a caliphate. Such maximalist goals admit of no moderation, for how can one persuade them to set their sights lower than that and aim for half a caliphate, if there is any such? Again, who are the leaders with whom one could negotiate, even if one found the option attractive? Since the identities of their leaders are shrouded in mystery, how could anybody purport to negotiate with an organization with no known leaders? Apart from the odd leadership struggle that occasionally makes its way into the news, there is general lack of genuine and credible information as to who is in charge. These realities notwithstanding, the continued use of indiscriminate violence puts everyone at risk, and even kidnappings, and they put pressure on states to act to protect their territories and their citizens. Then I talk of the design of the ASF and how it has become inappropriate because these warring groups don't operate according to regions. and it has necessitated the development of new mechanisms. The AU Commissioner indicated that although ECOWAS had deployed troops to Gambia and Guinea-Bissau, that effort did not count since it was not under the ESF. I read that part of his presentation over and over again because I could not believe that we would engage in terror wars on such issues instead of seeking cooperation and incorporation. Not to be outdone in complicating the terrain of peace and security in West Africa, the governments of Mali and Burkina Faso have enlisted the assistance of the Russian mercenary military group, the Wagner Group, and have chased out French. With the Wagner Group itself recently caught up in some confusion in the nature of the mutiny against its state military handlers, it is unclear what the import of that manifestation will be on the sub-region. For the sub-region, the very presence of a foreign mercenary force is discomforting enough and presents new security challenges for governments and their security setups. Such leadership denoted intra-group power struggles can easily degenerate into the formation of splinter groups with consequent issues of command and control over elements that could turn rogue if not speedily reined in. Foreign fighters being recruited to fight in these wars has meant that powerful arms find their way into their countries of origin or nearby countries to which they resort as safe havens. It is no secret that arms supplied to fighters in Libya eventually found their way southward and destabilized the Sahel. This has caused me some anxiety since I heard of cluster bombs in Ukraine, for they will soon find their way into these parts if not firmly controlled. The question is, who has firm control over fighters who turn rogue and leave the theater of war to pursue other interests, and with the arms they were supplied with? Let our African leaders speak up while there's yet an opportunity to avoid these situations. Our educational systems and the absence of integrity in operations continue to pose challenges to the system. These challenges are not unrelated to the integrity deficit in our governance that we lament so often. If it is true that many politicians cut their teeth in student politics on the various campuses, then this is not a challenge that can be addressed by the imposition of criminal penalties only. How many student governments leave office without one scandal or the other pertaining to the mishandling of student government? I'm sure you remember your days on campus, and we shall uproot them like cassava. Therefore, catch them young must be less of a catchphrase and more of a call to action and integrity in the political class that has to be built up in educational institutions. Thank you, Ashesi, for showing the way. Hopefully, that model will be replicated across a wider spectrum of society. Leadership of all categories, faith-based ones included, could use some of the ethical tutoring that Ashesi offers its students. In Chapter 4, the Vice President for Jobs, Growth and Competition in the EU, his name presents a challenge to me which I will avoid at this hour, indicated that they are interested in a partnership of equals in which we support each other. And then he said, we propose a comprehensive framework composed of 4 interconnected strands of action. First, strategic investment in areas with most potential for job creation. Second, boosting labor market mismatch. Third, improving investment climate and business environment. And fourth, strengthening economic integration and trade within Africa and between Africa and Europe. This new direction, if true, should be good news for our country, for a country that wants to rise beyond aid and claim equality in partnership with its former benefactors. It should also be good news to a country with a youth bulge and growing numbers of youth without employable skills. The graveyard of the Mediterranean Sea has swallowed up enough of our young people. It's time to say enough. The providence of artificial intelligence technologies that are reputed to have the potential to eliminate certain jobs should engage our attention in the fight to provide jobs for our youth and keep them on the continent. A presidential commission on the new technologies is urgently required so that the breadth and ramifications of the new technologies, including our own digitalization efforts, could receive attention and regulation. Too many citizens are being left behind by this technological revolution with serious social and political ramifications. I understand that some people our age feel really to have achieved something when they send a WhatsApp message. In chapter 5, Professor Wole Soyinka's Afro-pessimism gives much food for thought. He complained that history was not being taught in Nigerian schools and wondered what the situation was here. I am afraid it is no different. I do not know whose idea it was to remove history as a subject from the curriculum and then to so dilute it into a range of social studies disciplines that many of the younger generation know very little of our history. The referment of the mausoleum and its subsequent opening to the public a few days ago should enable us to strike out in a different direction and adopt a slightly different trajectory of memorialization. President Nkrumah stood for many things, being the first post-independence leader. His Africa must unite, African personality, and the independence declaration that our independence is meaningless unless it is linked up with the total liberation of the African continent, marked him as a doomed leader. Who talk of Operation Feed Yourself and Grow What You Eat and Eat What You Grow campaigns did nothing to endear himself to those who had an interest in continuing Ghana's dependence on external support. The emergence of severe economic challenges and consequent conflict with my generation, for which we can't apologize enough, meant that the survival of the regime was only a question of time. The leader has begun to beyond aid. Our development partners have expressed support for the move. Should we not expect and prepare for pushback in various forms? Is the current economic crisis some such manifestation? Time will tell. Therefore, CFR has its work cut out for it when history is no longer taught as a standalone subject except as a specialized course. Keep repeating themselves. I hope the Nkrumah Center will develop mechanisms for mounting scholarly lectures and symposia, not praise singing and adulation, that would help us to fill the gaps in our knowledge of that great Ghana. Memorializing events of the past would help us keep the lessons of history before us and provide contemporary analysis of our strategic interests. Madam Chair, there's a long conclusion, but since you have heard the body, I believe you don't need me to conclude. I thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for the erudite and challenging presentation.
How many seconds did you use?
Thank you. May I now invite Mr. Zichi to introduce our special guest.
Okay.
I'm sorry. Yes. Okay. You have the floor now.
Excellencies, all the wonderful things you have heard from the reviewer and the issues arising from myself are all here. And I'm sure that we have titillated you enough for you to obtain copies. Contemporary issues in foreign policy, diplomacy, and international affairs is duly launched.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm sure everybody's itching to get their hands on a copy of the book. I believe the copies will be available outside. Thank you, Mr. Ishadu. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you very much, Your Ladyship, for an insightful presentation laced with and lubricated with a lot of humor. It was wonderful. Thank you. Obviously, that will make it into the next edition. In fact, it will be the first article, the first piece in the next edition, to which you are all duly invited already. Yeah, something struck me as you were going on about a non-aligned movement. You said it had, it stopped moving. By the way, the book is a mere 200 CDs, just 200 CDs. We'll be delighted if we're able to pay more for one, or buy multiple copies for friends, neighbors, and enemies alike. I'd like to recognize, by the way, just a few people. General Obedakwa, former Chief of Defense Staff, Ambassador Hassan, Dr. Eugene Owusu, Presidential Advisor on SDGs, Ambassador Tenkrang, who is himself a foundation member of the of CFR, of course, and Ambassador Kabrabli Amehe, Vice President, and Ambassador Hananyako Ekwa, Ambassadors Hananyako Ekwa Hinkra and Jane Gasu are representing the Honorable Foreign Minister and the Chief Director, who are unable to be here and send their sincere apologies. Now I'd like to have a short presentation ceremony for a few people and institutions in particular are sponsors. So I would invite Ms. Isuman here to, you bring the books. Yes, please do, quickly. We'll present a handful of copies to GNP, NCA, VRA, and Supreme Concepts, who are partners and sponsors. And I would ask Madam Chair to kindly do the presentation. Where should we do it? Okay. And then we'll also, after that, we'll also present some copies to the contributors who are here as well. And that will be done, yes, and that will be done by Ambassador DK Osei. Oh, okay, all right, okay. Please, ma'am, would like, if you don't mind, to come to the front, please. Yeah, that'll do that. So, which one is it? This way. Okay. Let me do the institutions first. Okay. So, if there's a representative of the Ministry of, well, there is, I just announced that Ministry of Foreign Affairs would like to hand you a copy. And Madam Chair, Ambassador Chair, will present it. So a representative of the Foreign Ministry.
Foreign Ministry, Sheriff.
Okay, all right. So the Foreign Ministry, GNPC. We have GNPC here, a rep of GNPC, a rep of VRA, Volunteer Authority. Just get ready if you're here. NCA, National Communications Authority. So that's GNPC. Thank you very much for your support to CFR over the years. National Lotteries Authority, NLA. Petroleum Commission. Petroleum Commission is not here. And Supreme Concept. Supreme Concept? They're not here either. Okay. So then I shall move on to the individual contributors, starting with Dr. Muhammad Ibn Chambers. Dr. Eugene Owusu. Dr. Eugene Owusu. Honorable Dr. Emmanuel Bombande. So maybe we'll present to Honorable Bombande, Dr. Bombande, before Dr. Eugene Owusu, who is still making his way through the pews. So that's Dr. Bombande, thank you very much. Dr. Eugene Owusu is next. And then Dr. K.O. Amening. Dr. K.O. Amening. I'd also like to invite Honorable Hackman Owusu Ajiman to receive a copy. And Honorable Osei Eji, former Deputy Foreign Minister and subsequently full Foreign Minister. Okay. Professor Akuya Kwenye here. Professor Akuya Kwenye here. Lieutenant General Obed Akwa. Yes, he's here. He's currently the ambassador in Egypt. He shed the military fatigues for a suit. Professor Mary Chinrihese will bring your copy, Mrs. Chinrihese. And then Mrs. Agri Olens will present a copy to herself. The President will present to you, ma'am. Thank you. Oh, there's one more. Mr. Freddie Blake. Yeah. Yes. She'll do it for you. Thank you. I think that's it. Thank you. I'm sorry, I was distracted.
I take it that you will now introduce our special.
Yes, just before we do that, there's a short video interlude. Now, yes, it's not on the program. It was, this. You have people like Ambassador Cabral Biam here who have veto powers, and after the program is printed, he centered something. So, oh, it's there. Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Apologies. Okay. All right. I'm sorry. I've just been told that there's one more copy of the book. Okay. Can you just pause it? Can you pause it for a second so that the context can be established? Thank you very much. Okay. So there's also a copy of the book for her leadership. So if you could just do that. Now I'm going to be introducing Mrs. Chinwe Hesse, who's going to launch the appeal for people like yourselves to do your memoirs. And the idea struck Ambassador Cabral Mehi after he saw a 2-minute clip of an interview I did maybe 20 years ago with then businessman Cyril Ramaphosa. And he suggested to me that I too must write, and went on to suggest that I play this. It's just 2 minutes. So that's the context preceding my introduction of Mrs. Chinwe Hesse, and then she will then speak to us with regard to launching the Memoirs project. So please go back to the beginning and let's see that.
I'm in business I'm in business now and enjoying it.
So have you taken
adding value to the growth of our economy.
So have you taken back?
I am in business right now.
And as you might well know,
I'm in business and I'm enjoying being in business. And as you might well know, I'm a member of the National Executive Committee of the ANC. So I sit on the National Executive Committee, having been elected at the same time, I'm a businessman.
So you haven't tendered?
It is a good balance for me to be
are you interested in the
National
presidency?
Executive.
So
Are you interested in the presidency?
once you have that type of involvement of being
Are you interested in the presidency?
Once you have
you have
that
a
type of
complete wholesome view
the National Executive and being in business,
of life,
you have a
of the
complete
economy,
wholesome view
and some of the things that need to be done in our
life,
country.
Would we include politics?
and
Oh,
naturally that need to be
I mean,
in our
the
country.
economy is really about
Which we do
politics as well. That's right.
Naturally. Are you interested in the presidency?
economy
I
is
mean,
really
given the view that you have now, as you just described, are you interested in the presidency? Given the view that you have now, as you just described, it should stand you in good stead for the job. So you're not ruling
I'm in business, and as I've said, I'm enjoying being in
Okay, so you're not ruling it. You are not ruling out the possibility that you would seek a job.
I am in business.
So I don't hear you
That is
ruling
a
out
very
the question
worthwhile and interesting.
So I don't hear you ruling out the question of interest in the presidency. I don't hear that.
I am a businessman. Thank you very much.
Well, so that was me and now President Cyril Ramaphosa, 20 years younger, both of us. Okay. And well, the rest is history, as they say, and never say never. So thank you, Cabral, for pushing me. So I'm going to be working on my memoirs as well. And I'll proceed to introduce Mrs. Mary Chinwe Hesse, and once again I'll keep this in the summary version of so Mrs. Chinwe Hesse is the Chancellor of the University of Ghana, the first woman to be so appointed female Under Secretary General of the UN when she became Deputy Director General of the International Labour Organization. She subsequently became a Chief Advisor to President John Kufuor, working hand in hand with Ambassador D.K. Osei as part of a triumvirate that held the President on the street in Nagano. She was a member of the Eminent Persons panel responsible for crafting the transition of the Organization of African Union to the African Union. She's a laureate of the Greasy Peace Prize, referred to as the Asian Nobel Peace Prize, although I believe she's deserving of the Nobel as well. She's the first African woman to receive that honor. And well, she's here to launch this project, and we just add that above all, she's also a product of West Middle High School, best school in Canada after
Thank you very much, May I now invite my senior, Mary, to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Lady Chair, and naughty Ambassador D.K. Osei, who is always pestering me for one thing or the other. This is just the last in the line. I hope no more will come. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to be very short because we have witnessed a most impressive and thought-provoking ceremony this afternoon, which is the launch of the Council's latest publication, Contemporary Issues in Foreign Policy, Diplomacy and International Affairs. Between Her Ladyship, Professor Mensah Bonsu, and Dr. Boama, it has all been said. The volume captures so appropriately the raison d'etre for the establishment of the Council on Foreign Relations Ghana. I feel so privileged that I am associated with this important initiative. The Council is already doing such exciting work as it hosts important encounters with distinguished personalities who are masters in their areas of expertise. I want to congratulate the brains behind the establishment of the Council. I think we should recognize them with a clap offering. But I digress. I mean, the work has already been done. But my task here this, shall I say evening now? It's dark out. Is to launch an important project, the CFR Ghana Memoirs Project Fund. I'm flattered by the honor done me by the invitation for me to launch such an important project. Our country, Ghana, has had a checkered history. I don't think anybody would doubt that. We have lived through events which have disrupted an orderly retention of knowledge of actual events in the country. There have been situations where citizens have actually fled into exile with whatever first-hand knowledge they might have accumulated by actually living through or observing activities in the country. Others have just kept mute, not sharing information out of fear, sometimes also out of trauma. In this manner, the country might have lost a good deal of relevant knowledge. Thus, true history of the country has in many instances remained in the hearts and minds of people who have not bothered to put anything on paper for posterity. The situation has led to distortion of facts, when the truth of what truly happened still lies or died in the bosom of actors and witnesses of historical events who failed to share. The country's legacy has therefore run the risk of distortion, and I think we all know that. Since the past has not always been appropriately captured, depriving the country of lessons from past events. And there is no doubt that even many of us in this room, as I look around, will have interesting stories to tell, because we are the ones who have been privileged to be born and have lived in interesting times. Colonial rule, I bet the people in this room, most of them would have been born during the colonial time, although I see many young ones as well. And these have been interesting times. Also, we actually witnessed, a lot of us in this room, the declaration of Ghana's independence. And we have lived through a number of coups d'etats, coup d'etat after coup d'etat, etc. For many of us, our experiences have not always been pleasant. And many have been put in a state where they would not dare say anything to be quoted for fear of some form of reprisal or revenge from people whose toes might feel stepped upon. The project which is now being launched is intended to encourage people like ourselves in this room and many retired diplomats and other professionals to share their experiences with future generations through writing their memoirs. Indeed, while writing of memoirs may help to preserve the country's legacy and facilitate gaining of some insights into the past, it might offer also an opportunity through pouring out of one's heart, of being healed from traumatic experiences, a sort of catharsis. You know, that happened. Let's bring everything out, and we'll feel better after that. City TV has been airing a program which is hosted on Saturday mornings by its boss, Samuel Atamensa, named Footprints. Ambassador D.K. Osei Your participation in this program got us all glued to our seats. You narrated incidents which would have forever remained in the closet were it not for your interview. It was juicy and Toli, special Toli. We listened to the end. No wonder you have been after me to also publish my memoirs. Would I have your courage to include similar incidents as you did? I tell everybody, just you wait. I might just surprise you. For all and sundry who have been putting so much pressure on me to publish my memoirs, to share the varied experience I have garnered after decades of public and international service, led by you, Dike, I want to assure you that these are nearly ready. I will surprise everybody one of these days, very soon, I hope. A special plea to the diplomatic service of Ghana. It is not acceptable that a service that has produced so many distinguished diplomats since independence in 1957, and who must have some unique pioneering experiences in Ghana's diplomatic encounters to share, have only a few, beginning with Dr. Alex Kwesi-Nsaki, having published their memoirs. Hopefully, this project will provide a platform for many to write their memoirs. We're going to look out for it. I hope you accept the challenge to share. Don't die with the knowledge. Interestingly, just this morning, President Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo, eulogizing the late, brilliant, old girl of the great school, Wesley Girls High School, drew attention to the African saying, very relevant to the objects of the project I'm launching now, which indicates that when certain old people pass on, they take with them a whole library because they didn't capture their life story to share for posterity. May this project minimize such situations in our country, Ghana. I know you are all tired, so I'm going to stop here and just say that it is my privilege to declare the project CFR Ghana Memoirs Project Fund duly launched. God bless. God bless, and thank you all very much for your patience. I'm waiting for everybody's invitation to when they launch their own memoirs. I'm waiting. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Madam Chancellor. At this stage, I am expected to make a few remarks as chairperson. Firstly, I don't think that there is any more to add. There's any more to say. I cannot myself think of a better way of spending an afternoon of thought-provoking statement. I'm sure you'll all agree
with me that we are greatly enriched in our knowledge and perception. I thank the Council on Foreign Relations Ghana for this initiative, and together I feel we can look forward to the next volume of the handbook. On that note, I invite Mr. Sichiado to give the vote of thanks and to reiterate. Are you listening, sir? And to reiterate the invitation to the cocktail which the Council is offering after this event. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Indeed, everyone is invited to the cocktail in the foyer here. Just wanted, thank you, wanted to also just quickly recognize Ambassador Kuat Danswa, Ambassador Brandful, and my friend Brigadier Richard Addo as well. So thank you. I think what remains really to be done is to say a big thank you to everyone for coming, especially the chairperson, Mrs. Agrio-Lins, your leadership, Mrs. Professor Dr. Henrietta Mensah Bonsu, Mrs. Chinri Hesse, Dr. Boama, and of course our president, Ambassador D.K. Osei, every one of you. You're just as special. Thanks, and join us for drinks after here. Have a good night. And looking forward to reading Dr. Chambers' book. Looking forward to reading your book. Your memoirs. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. There is an important announcement that I omitted. One quick. Can I have your attention, please? Can I have your attention for just a second? Your attention for just a second. We've actually just received a donation, an anonymous donation of 20,000 Ghana cedis into the CFR account for the Memoirs Project. 20,000 cedis, and would like to ask you here that the account is open and there's a lot of room for further donations. Thank you very much.
In 2019, Ghana established her first policy think tank dedicated to foreign policy and international affairs. The Council on Foreign Relations CFR Ghana, an independent, private, non-partisan and non-profit institution, was officially inaugurated on February 26, 2019 by President Akufo-Addo. But it was a dream brought to fruition by a handful of like-minded individuals led chiefly by the journalist and diplomat Ambassador Cabral Blay Amihie and public servant and veteran diplomat Ambassador D.K. Osei, who is the founding president of CFR Ghana. Other founding members of CFR Ghana include Brigadier General Francis Esiedu Ajemfra, Ambassador Lawrence R.A. Satu, Egbert Fable Jr., Abraham Agbozo, the late Kojo Benti Enchel, Kweku Sechiado, and Dr. Linda Ekweopoma Dakwa. Founding members spent many hours on weekends huddling and haggling over the fine points of corporate governance, the law, diplomacy, communications and public relations, and even the aesthetics and nuances of typefaces, fonts, and logos. Despite its 2019 birth, CFR Ghana's conception occurred much earlier, with its official registration at the Registrar General's on February 20.